Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the after-midnight streets of New York, where storefront lights glow softly on empty sidewalks and quiet conversations shape unseen empires. This is the world of Matthew Ianniello, a man guided by patience, not impulse, where respect was earned through steadiness, not noise, and every decision was made with careful restraint. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because it was loud or chaotic, but because it demanded absolute control in a world that never stopped testing it. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's shadowed corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city hush deepen, and settle in as we ease into the calm, calculated story of Matthew Ianniello. The city never really slept, but that night it breathed differently. The sidewalks held onto the warmth of the day, neon lights shimmered like half-remembered dreams, and somewhere between a laugh drifting out of a nightclub and the hum of traffic, a man walked as if the streets belonged to him. Matty Ianniello didn't rush. He never had to. When you understood the rhythm of a city, you didn't chase it, you let it come to you. They called him the horse, and not because he was loud or wild. It was because he could carry weight others couldn't. Long nights, endless conversations, favors stacked on favors, promises remembered years later when everyone else had forgotten. Matty carried it all without complaint. He had a way of listening that made people feel seen, and a way of speaking that made them feel safe. In a world where tempers flared and egos clashed, that was a rare and valuable thing. He learned that early, long before the city learned his name. As a boy, Matty watched grown men talk themselves into trouble. They talked too much, bragged too openly, trusted too easily. He noticed how the quiet ones lasted longer. The ones who smiled, nodded, and remembered everything. Matty became one of those. He learned to sit back, to absorb the room, to understand not just what people said, but why they said it. New York in those days was a promise wrapped in noise. Immigrants poured in with suitcases full of hope and pockets full of worry. Streets changed names depending on who walked them, and opportunity hid behind doors that only opened if you knocked the right way. Matty learned how to knock. He worked small jobs at first, the kind no one wrote about and no one remembered, but each one taught him something. Who paid on time, who talked too much, who needed help and who pretended they didn't. He had a gift for remembering faces. Years later, he could recall a man he'd met once in a smoky back room, remember the drink he ordered, the joke he laughed at, the problem he mentioned like it didn't matter. When Matty brought that problem up again months later, solved and neatly wrapped, people didn't forget. They remembered him. Nightlife became his classroom. Restaurants, bars, clubs, places where people loosened their ties and their tongues. Matty understood that when people were relaxed, they were honest. He didn't see these places as chaos. He saw them as systems. Every door had a purpose. Every employee had a story. Every owner had a fear they didn't say out loud. Matty didn't exploit those fears. He eased them. He offered stability in an unstable world, and people welcomed him for it. While others argued over territory, Matty built bridges. He introduced people who had no reason to trust each other and gave them one. A shared table, a shared problem, a shared solution. Slowly, quietly, his influence spread. Not like a storm, but like a tide. You didn't notice it rising until suddenly it was everywhere. He wasn't interested in headlines. Attention was dangerous. Matty preferred the comfort of familiar booths and late-night coffee, the kind served when the city softened and truths slipped out easier. He learned which entertainers needed protection from bad contracts, which owners needed help navigating city rules, which unions held the real keys to keeping the lights on. He didn't demand loyalty. He earned it. There were nights when the city felt like a living thing, pulsing and unpredictable. On those nights, Matty walked through it like a calm thought passing through a restless mind. People nodded when they saw him. Some smiled. Some relaxed their shoulders without realizing why. He made things smoother. That was his reputation. If Matty was involved, things would be handled. Quietly, properly. He understood patience better than most. While others chased quick wins, Maddie planted seeds. A favor here, a recommendation there. Time did the rest. Years later, those seeds grew into something solid, something dependable. He didn't measure success by money alone, but by how many doors opened before he even reached for the handle. At home, he was unremarkable in the best way. He valued routine, simple meals, familiar faces. He believed chaos should stay outside. That belief shaped everything he did. His world might have been complicated, but his rules were simple. Don't embarrass people, don't forget kindness, and never forget who helped you when you needed it most. As the city grew louder and faster, Maddie stayed the same. That was his secret. While trends came and went, while power shifted hands, he remained steady. People trusted steady. They leaned on it, and without realizing it, they built their lives around it. By the time many noticed how influential he'd become, it felt like he'd always been there. Like a street you'd walked 1,000 times without knowing its name. Maddie didn't correct them. He didn't need credit. He just needed things to keep moving, smoothly and quietly, like a song playing softly in the background of a long night. And somewhere, deep in the city's bones, New York seemed to agree. The city rewarded consistency, and Maddie Ianniello was nothing if not consistent. Every night followed a rhythm, and Maddie learned to hear it the way a musician hears time. He knew when a club would start filling before the first coat was checked, when a bartender would begin to worry about inventory, when a manager's smile meant everything was fine and when it meant the opposite. He didn't interrupt those rhythms. He adjusted them gently, the way one hand steadies a spinning plate. People often mistook his calm for softness. That misunderstanding worked in his favor. While others raised their voices to be heard, Maddie lowered his. People leaned in. They always did. He never argued in public, never cornered anyone, never forced decisions. He preferred conversations that felt accidental, like two people happening to arrive at the same conclusion at the same time. When someone walked away thinking an idea was their own, Maddie knew he'd done his job well. As his influence widened, so did the variety of people who crossed his path. Singers with raw talent and no guidance. Club owners juggling permits they barely understood. Politicians who enjoyed the city's nightlife but feared its unpredictability. Maddie became the quiet line connecting them all. He didn't promise miracles. He promised order. In a city that thrived on chaos, order was priceless. He had a habit of showing up early, sitting in the corner watching a room come alive. He observed how people greeted one another, who avoided eye contact, who laughed a beat too late. These details told him everything. He remembered them all. Weeks later, when he casually asked about a sick relative or a delayed shipment, people felt known. And people who felt known tended to trust. Maddie believed trust was stronger than fear. Fear faded. Trust lingered. It shaped decisions long after conversations ended. He built his world around that belief, brick by brick, favor by favor. He never rushed. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes drew attention. Attention was the one thing he avoided. There were nights when someone new tried to disrupt the balance. A loud voice, a reckless promise, a plan that ignored the delicate web Maddie had spent years weaving. He didn't confront them directly. Instead, he let the city teach them. Doors closed unexpectedly. Opportunities dried up. Invitations stopped coming. Most learned quickly. Those who didn't usually drifted away, convinced the city just wasn't for them. Maddie watched trends rise and fall. Jazz gave way to new sounds. Small clubs turned into grand rooms filled with light and motion. The city reinvented itself again and again, and Maddie adapted without changing who he was. He understood that while styles changed, people didn't. They still wanted security. They still wanted respect. They still wanted someone reliable standing quietly behind the scenes. He had an unusual talent for making people feel important without making them feel managed. A nod at the right moment. A word of encouragement before a big night. A reminder that someone was watching out for them. These gestures cost him nothing and earned him everything. Loyalty built that way didn't demand constant maintenance. It lived on its own. Sometimes, Late at night, Matty would walk alone, listening to the echo of his footsteps. He thought about how far he'd come from the boy who learned to stay quiet and observe. He didn't feel pride the way others did. What he felt was responsibility. The city depended on balance, and balance depended on people who understood restraint. As the years passed, Matty's name became something people mentioned carefully, not out of fear, but respect. "He'll know what to do," they'd say, or, "Let Matty handle it." Those words carried weight. They meant problems would be solved without noise, without embarrassment, without unnecessary damage. In a city that loved spectacle, Matty specialized in subtlety. He never claimed ownership over anything. He preferred stewardship. He took care of things, kept them running, protected them from excess and neglect. He understood that control didn't require dominance. Sometimes it only required patience and a steady presence. And as the night stretched on and the city hummed its endless lullaby, Matty the horse Ianniello remained exactly where he wanted to be. Moving quietly through the spaces between people, carrying burdens others never saw, shaping outcomes without leaving fingerprints behind. By the time Matty realized how many lives quietly leaned on his decisions, it was already too late to step back. Not because he was trapped, but because the city had folded him into its routine. He was part of how things worked now, like the last train of the night or the diner that never closed. People didn't announce when they needed him. Circumstances simply arranged themselves. Until Matty was there. He noticed it in small moments. A manager waiting before making a call. An entertainer glancing toward the door before signing a contract. A city official pausing, then asking casually if Matty had any thoughts. These pauses told him more than words ever could. They meant people trusted his judgment, even when they didn't fully understand it. Matty never let that trust harden into arrogance. He treated it like glass, useful, valuable, and easy to shatter if handled carelessly. Every decision carried weight, so he made them slowly. He believed the best outcomes were the ones no one noticed at all. When a problem disappeared without drama, when a night ended peacefully, when everyone went home satisfied, that was success. There were evenings when the city tested him. A venue on the brink of collapse. A partnership strained by misunderstanding. A promise made too quickly, now unraveling. Matty listened more than he spoke. He asked questions that didn't feel like questions. He let people talk themselves into clarity. By the time he offered a solution, it felt inevitable, like the only reasonable path forward. He had an instinct for timing. He knew when to act and, more importantly, when not to. Sometimes doing nothing was the strongest move. Letting tempers cool. Letting reality settle. Letting people realize on their own what mattered most. Matty trusted time the way others trusted force. As his world expanded, so did the quiet pressure. There were nights when sleep came slowly, when the hum of the city followed him home. He didn't complain. Pressure meant relevance. Relevance meant he was useful. And usefulness to Matty was purpose. He never wanted to be admired. He wanted to be needed. The younger ones watched him closely. They tried to copy his calm, his patience, his way of standing slightly apart from the center of attention. Few succeeded. Matty understood why. What he did couldn't be rushed or learned from the outside. Came from years of listening, from mistakes absorbed quietly, from choosing restraint when impulse would have been easier. He sometimes wondered how long he could keep carrying so much without showing it. Then he'd sit in a familiar booth, sip his coffee, and feel the city settle back into its rhythm. The answer always arrived the same way. As long as he stayed himself. As long as he remembered that power was something you held lightly, not something you squeezed until it broke. People often assumed Matty had a grand plan, a final destination he was working toward. The truth was simpler. He wanted continuity. He wanted tomorrow to feel manageable, predictable, calm. In a place built on constant change, that was a rare gift. And he gave it freely without asking for thanks. On certain nights, when the streets emptied and the lights dimmed, Matty walked a little slower. He listened to the quiet version of the city, the one most people never noticed. It reminded him why he chose this path. Not for control, not for recognition, but for balance. for the steady hum beneath the noise. And as dawn crept in and the city prepared to wake again, Matty the horse Ianniello remained exactly what he had always been. A quiet constant in an unpredictable world, carrying more than most, and never once asking anyone to notice. Morning in the city had a different honesty to it. The laughter was gone, the music quieted, and what remained were people sweeping floors, counting receipts, unlocking doors for a new day. Matty liked this hour best. It showed him the bones of the place. No pretending, no performance, just effort. He respected effort. He often stopped by places before they officially opened, not to inspect, but to understand. A tired cook rubbing his eyes, a cleaner humming softly while mopping, a manager reviewing numbers with a furrowed brow. Matty greeted them the same way he greeted everyone else, with warmth, with memory, with attention. He remembered names. He remembered stories. That alone set him apart. Word spread quietly that Matty noticed things. If a place was struggling, he'd hear about it before the lights started flickering. If someone was on the brink of giving up, Matty usually arrived before they did. He never framed his help as rescue. He framed it as adjustment. A tweak here, a suggestion there. He believed most problems didn't need force. They needed alignment. The city, however, never stopped changing. New faces arrived with big dreams and bigger impatience. Some tried to skip steps to demand influence without earning trust. Matty watched them carefully. He didn't block them outright. He let reality introduce itself. Some adapted. Some faded. A few surprised him by slowing down, listening, and learning. Those were the ones he kept an eye on. He was often invited to gatherings where important decisions were supposedly being made. He rarely spoke first. He waited, letting the room reveal itself. Who interrupted whom? Who avoided certain topics? Who spoke confidently and who hid behind jokes? By the time Matty spoke, everyone was already listening, even if they didn't realize it yet. There were moments when things nearly tipped too far. A misunderstanding grew legs. A rumor traveled faster than truth. Matty stepped in gently, often through someone else. A word passed along. A clarification offered quietly. He believed dignity mattered. People listened more when they weren't embarrassed. His reputation grew not because of what he took, but because of what he prevented. Disasters that never happened. Conflicts that dissolved before forming. Careers saved with a single phone call. People rarely thanked him directly. They thanked him by continuing, by trusting, by keeping things steady. At home, Matty remained grounded. He believed power lost its usefulness the moment it followed you everywhere. He didn't bring the city inside. He valued ordinary things. Familiar food, predictable evenings, silence when he needed it. That balance kept him sharp. It reminded him who he was without the noise. As years passed, the weight he carried changed shape. It grew quieter but heavier. Fewer emergencies, more expectations. People assumed he would always be there, always know what to do. Matty accepted that without complaint. He understood that being relied upon was the price of stability. Sometimes, late at night, he wondered what the city would sound like without him. The thought passed quickly. He didn't dwell on absence. He focused on presence. On the moment in front of him. On the next small correction that would keep everything running smoothly. The city tested him again and again, and each time Matty responded the same way. Not with force, not with fear, but with patience. He believed patience was the most underestimated strength of all. It allowed you to see patterns others missed. It let you act without being seen. As another night unfolded and lights flickered on across the streets, Matty moved through the familiar paths, unhurried, attentive, carrying the quiet weight of a city that trusted him more than it knew. And once again, without ceremony, he did what he had always done, kept the balance. By now, Matty understood something few people ever did. Stability attracts pressure. The smoother things ran, the more people leaned on the system, testing its limits without meaning to. He felt it in the pauses before phone calls, in the way conversations drifted toward expectation rather than request. People didn't ask if he could help anymore. They assumed he would. He adjusted quietly. He delegated more through trust than instruction, letting capable hands feel ownership rather than oversight. When people felt responsible, they acted carefully. Maddie believed responsibility was contagious. If one person took it seriously, others followed. That belief shaped how he moved pieces without appearing to move them at all. There were nights when the city tried to pull him in too many directions at once. A venue facing sudden trouble. A relationship fraying over pride. A situation that needed immediate calm before it turned noisy. Maddie handled these moments the same way he handled everything else. One conversation at a time. He never stacked problems. He unraveled them. He had learned the art of choosing words that softened rather than sharpened. He never said no outright if not yet would do. He never dismissed ideas. He redirected them. People left conversations with Maddie feeling heard, even when they didn't get exactly what they wanted. That feeling mattered more than the outcome. As younger figures rose around him, eager and restless, Maddie watched with quiet interest. Some burned brightly and quickly. Others slowed, learned, adapted. He offered guidance sparingly. Too much advice weakened growth. When he did speak, he spoke plainly, without drama or warning. Those moments stayed with people long after the words faded. He was aware that time moved differently for him now. Years passed in measured steps instead of sudden leaps. The city still changed, but Maddie had become one of its constants. That realization didn't make him proud. It made him careful. Constance carried responsibility. If he faltered, the ripple would travel far. There were evenings when he chose not to intervene, even when he could have. Trusting others to handle things was part of keeping balance. Control, he believed, should never feel tight. It should feel natural, like gravity, always there, rarely noticed. When problems resolved themselves, Maddie smiled quietly. That was the best outcome. It meant the system worked without him stepping in. His goal had never been to be central. It had been to make himself unnecessary without disappearing entirely. The city rewarded him in subtle ways. Familiar faces. Open doors. Conversations that began with ease rather than tension. These weren't trophies. They were confirmations. Signs that the balance held. Late at night, when streets thinned and the noise softened, Maddie sometimes paused to listen. The city spoke in patterns now, not surprises. He could hear when something was off, like a note slightly out of tune. He trusted that instinct more than any report or rumor. As another chapter of the city unfolded, Maddie moved forward the same way he always had. Steadily, thoughtfully, carrying weight without letting it show. And somewhere beneath the glow of streetlights and the quiet hum of engines, the city rested a little easier, knowing he was still there. The longer Maddie stayed in his position, the more he realized that influence didn't announce itself with sound. It showed up as silence. Silence where arguments should have been. Silence where panic usually rushed in. Silence that meant someone had stepped back, waited, and chosen restraint. That silence was his work, even when no one connected it to him. He began to notice how often people mirrored his pace. Meetings slowed. Decisions were postponed until tempers cooled. People who once rushed began to wait. It wasn't imitation so much as adaptation. The city, in its own way, was learning patience from him. There were moments when old habits resurfaced around him. Raised voices, rushed judgments, unnecessary tension. Maddie never corrected them directly. He changed the environment instead. A different setting. A smaller group. A pause long enough for pride to settle down. He believed people behaved better when they felt unobserved rather than challenged. With time, his role shifted again. He was no longer just solving problems, he was shaping how problems were approached. That was a quieter kind of influence, harder to trace and harder to replace. It meant fewer late-night calls, but more meaningful ones. When people called Maddie now, it wasn't because things were out of control. It was because they wanted to keep them that way. He became careful about energy, where he went, how long he stayed, who he gave attention to. Attention, he knew, was currency. Spent poorly, it lost value. Spent wisely, it created momentum. He chose moments where his presence mattered most and stayed invisible everywhere else. Sometimes he encountered resistance. Not loud, not obvious, but subtle. A hesitation, a guarded response. These didn't bother him. Resistance often came from uncertainty, not hostility. He met it with consistency. Consistency outlasted doubt every time. There were evenings when he felt the weight more than usual. Not exhaustion, but awareness. Awareness that many paths crossed because of decisions he'd nudged one way instead of another. He didn't replay those choices. Regret had no place in his rhythm. He trusted the process he'd built and the values that guided it. As the city's landscape shifted again, new sounds, new faces, new expectations, Matty adjusted without struggle. He had learned long ago that fighting change was pointless. Guiding it gently was far more effective. He stayed rooted while letting everything else move. People began speaking of him in past tense while he was still very much present. He's always been that way, they'd say, as if he were part of history rather than the moment. Matty found that comforting. It meant he blended seamlessly into the city's story, not standing apart from it. On quiet nights, he sat alone and listened, not to the noise, but to the absence of it. The absence told him everything was holding. That balance remained intact. That tomorrow would arrive without disruption. And so he continued, steady and unremarkable in the ways that mattered most, carrying the unseen weight of order through a city that rarely stopped to notice who kept it that way. Time had a way of thinning the crowd around Matty. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, like fog lifting at dawn. Some people moved on. Some lost interest. Some simply couldn't keep up with the patience his world required. What remained was a smaller circle, quieter, steadier, and far more dependable. Matty didn't mourn the thinning. He welcomed it. Fewer voices meant clearer patterns. Clearer patterns meant better decisions. He had learned that growth didn't always mean expansion. Sometimes it meant refinement. He noticed how people spoke differently around him now. Less performance, more honesty. They no longer tried to impress him. They tried to be understood. That shift mattered. It meant trust had settled in, deep and unshaken. Trust like that wasn't loud. It didn't need reinforcement. It simply existed. There were days when nothing seemed to happen at all. No calls. No emergencies. No decisions needing guidance. Those days were his quiet victories. They meant the systems held. They meant people had learned to carry their own weight, just as he had once learned to carry his. But the city never stayed still for long. New pressures emerged, subtle at first. Expectations from places he rarely visited. Questions framed as curiosity rather than concern. Matty recognized these moments. They were invitations not to step forward, but to be pulled into visibility. He declined them gently, the way one declines dessert after a satisfying meal. He believed visibility weakened influence. Once people watched too closely, they stopped acting naturally. Matty preferred authenticity. He stayed just out of sight, close enough to guide, far enough to preserve rhythm. Sometimes he tested the balance on purpose. He stepped back slightly, watched how situations unfolded without him. Most held. Some wobbled. When they did, he didn't rush in. He waited, let others adjust, let responsibility settle where it belonged. Only when things truly threatened to tilt did he intervene, and even then, lightly. He was often underestimated by those who didn't know him well. They mistook his restraint for passivity, his calm for disinterest. That never bothered him. Underestimation created space. Space allowed movement. At night, when the city shimmered again with music and motion, Matty walked familiar paths. He wasn't checking on things. He was listening to tone, to pace, to the subtle signals that told him whether balance still held. Most nights it did. He reflected sometimes on how different his life might have been if he'd chosen louder paths. He felt no regret. Loud paths burned quickly. Quiet ones lasted. He had built something durable even if it didn't have a name. People still called him the horse, though fewer remembered why. The name had outgrown its origin. It no longer described stamina alone. It described reliability, endurance, the ability to keep moving forward without needing applause. As another season shifted and the city adjusted its tempo once again, Maddie remained unchanged at the core. Observant, patient, present. He didn't ask the city for anything. He simply continued to give it what it needed most, steadiness in a place that rarely slowed long enough to appreciate it. And somewhere between one quiet night and the next, the city carried on, confident in a balance it didn't fully understand, guided by a man who never once demanded it recognize his hand. Age crept in the way it always did with Maddie, without announcement.
No dramàtic moment, no sudden realization.
Just a deeper appreciation for pace. He walked a little slower, listened a little longer, chose his words with even more care. The city didn't notice the change, and that pleased him. If anything, it leaned on him more, sensing the steadiness beneath the surface. He became more selective about where he placed his energy. Not because he had less of it, but because he understood its value better. Every conversation needed purpose now. Every appearance had to matter. He declined more invitations than he accepted, and those refusals were never questioned. People trusted his judgment enough to assume there was a reason. Younger voices filled the rooms more often. They brought new ideas, new urgency, new ways of seeing the city. Maddie welcomed them, listened without interruption, and let them speak themselves into clarity. He didn't measure them against his own path. He measured them by how willing they were to learn the rhythm rather than impose their own. He noticed that people came to him less for solutions and more for confirmation. They had already decided. They just wanted to know if their instincts aligned with his. When they did, Maddie nodded. When they didn't, he asked a question that made them pause. That pause usually did the rest. There were moments of reflection he kept to himself. Quiet evenings when he thought about how many unseen choices had shaped the city's nights. How many livelihoods had steadied because someone had chosen patience instead of reaction. He didn't romanticize it. He accepted it as responsibility fulfilled. The city around him continued its endless reinvention. Old places closed. New ones opened in their place. Sounds shifted. Styles changed. Maddie adapted easily. He understood that while surfaces transformed, underlying needs remained the same. People still wanted safety, respect, and continuity. He offered all three without ceremony. He found comfort in repetition.
Familiar roots. Familiar fases.
Familiar conversations that picked up where they left off years earlier. These weren't habits of stagnation. They were anchors. They kept him oriented while everything else moved. On rare occasions, someone asked him directly why he never stepped fully into the spotlight. Maddie smiled, shrugged lightly, and changed the subject. The truth was simple but difficult to explain. The spotlight distorted things. It bent motives, encouraged shortcuts, invited noise. He preferred clarity. As nights passed and mornings followed, Maddie felt less like a participant and more like a keeper of tempo. He didn't direct the city. He listened to it and adjusted accordingly. Like a conductor who never raised his baton, only guided with presence. And so he continued steady as ever, letting time layer itself gently around him. The city moved forward, confident and unaware, while Maddie the horse Ianniello remained its quiet constant, unchanged in essence, refined by years, and content to let the balance speak for itself. There came a point when Maddie began to sense endings, not as losses but as natural conclusions. Conversations wrapped themselves more cleanly. Long-standing issues resolved without replacement. People he had known for decades spoke more about stepping back than stepping forward. The city, too, seemed to exhale in longer breaths. Maddie didn't resist this phase. He welcomed it with the same calm he had brought to everything else. Endings, he believed, were just another form of balance. They made room. They allowed continuity to pass quietly from one set of hands to another. He spent more time listening than guiding now. People still sought his presence, but the urgency had softened. They came to share, not to ask, to reflect, not to fix. Maddie appreciated that shift. It meant they had learned to carry what he once carried alone. There were nights when he stayed home, letting the city hum without him. Those nights told him more than any report ever could. Things continued. The rhythm held. That knowledge brought a quiet satisfaction he had never sought but now fully understood. He became thoughtful about legacy, though he never used the word. He believed legacy should be lived, not announced. It showed up in habits others adopted, in standards they maintained without instruction, in restraint practiced when impulse beckoned. If those remained, nothing else mattered. Occasionally, someone new would arrive with questions shaped by curiosity rather than need. They'd ask how he knew when to act, when to wait, when to step back. Matty answered simply, if at all. He knew lessons learned too quickly rarely stayed. He found himself enjoying the city as a listener rather than a guardian. Sitting quietly, observing without adjusting, letting moments unfold without interference. It was a new role, and he accepted it without discomfort. The city still changed, but its changes felt gentler now. Or perhaps Matty had learned to see them that way. He understood that perspective shifted with time. What once felt urgent now felt manageable. What once felt heavy now felt complete. As seasons turned again, Matty remained present but lighter, as if the weight he had carried for so long had gradually distributed itself across the city. Balance no longer depended on him alone. It lived in others now. And in that realization, Matty, the horse Ianniello, found something rare, quiet contentment. Not triumph, not recognition, just the steady knowledge that what he had built would continue, softly and surely, long after the night lights dimmed and the city moved on to its next chapter. The days grew quieter in ways Matty hadn't anticipated but somehow understood. Fewer interruptions, fewer expectations carried in other people's voices. When the phone rang now, it was often just to check in, to share a thought, to confirm that the rhythm still felt right. Matty appreciated those calls more than the urgent ones of years past. He noticed how often people filled silence when they were unsure, and how rarely they did when they felt steady. Around him, silence had become comfortable. Conversations paused without tension. Decisions rested without anxiety. That, to Matty, was the clearest sign that balance had taken root beyond his direct influence. He began to take longer walks, not to observe or assess, but to remember. Streets held layers of memory for him. Faces, voices, moments that had shaped the flow of years. He didn't linger on any one memory for long. He let them pass like familiar songs enjoyed briefly, then released. Younger figures still sought him out, but differently now. They didn't come with problems. They came with reflections. Stories of how they'd handled situations on their own, hoping quietly that he'd nod. When he did, their relief was visible. Approval from Matty carried weight precisely because it was never given lightly. He had learned to accept gratitude without deflection. Not because he needed it, but because refusing it sometimes robbed others of closure. A simple nod. A quiet, "You did well." That was enough. There were moments when he felt the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. Not loss, but transition. He was moving from center to edge, from anchor to horizon. The city no longer leaned on him. It carried him in its memory, even while he remained present. Matty paid closer attention to small pleasures. Good coffee, a familiar voice, the comfort of routine. These were not retreats. They were rewards. Proof that a life built on restraint still allowed for enjoyment. He no longer felt the need to be everywhere. In fact, being nowhere in particular suited him. It meant things worked without supervision. It meant the balance he valued had matured. As another night settled over the city, Matty listened to its softened hum and felt no urge to intervene, adjust, or guide. He trusted it now. Trusted the people. Trusted the systems shaped quietly over time. And in that trust, Matty, the horse Ianniello, found peace. Not the kind that arrives suddenly, but the kind that grows slowly, settles deeply, and stays. The city began to treat Matty the way old neighborhoods treat certain buildings. Not landmarks exactly, but constants. The kind you notice only when they're gone. He was still around, still moving through familiar spaces, but people spoke to him with a gentler tone now, as if acknowledging something unspoken. Respect had softened into care. He felt it when someone insisted he sit instead of stand. when a conversation slowed to match his pace without anyone saying a word, when decisions were presented not for correction, but for sharing. These moments didn't make him uncomfortable. They felt earned. Maddie had never feared change, but he had learned to recognize when change was no longer something to guide, only something to allow. He stepped aside more often, not as retreat, but as invitation. Others filled the space thoughtfully. That pleased him. He became more reflective, not nostalgic. He didn't dwell on what had been. He considered what remained. What remained was rhythm, courtesy, restraint, the quiet understanding that not everything needed to be pushed forward to matter. These were values he'd lived by without naming them, and now he saw them living on in others. There were afternoons when he met people he'd known for decades and said very little at all. Words weren't necessary anymore. A shared look,
a familiar silence.
That was enough. It meant trust had outgrown explanation. He was asked once, gently, whether he ever wished he'd chosen a different path. Maddie thought about it longer than he answered. Then he smiled and said he'd chosen the only path that let him sleep at night. That answer stayed with the person who asked long after the conversation ended. The city continued to hum, but Maddie heard it differently now. Less like a challenge, more like a conversation nearing its natural pause. He didn't rush that pause. He honored it. He found joy in watching others navigate moments he once would have handled himself. They made different choices sometimes. Not better, not worse, just theirs. That distinction mattered. It meant the balance was no longer dependent on one way of thinking. As evenings turned quieter and nights stretched longer, Maddie felt a sense of completion he'd never chased. Not an ending, but a settling. A feeling that something had been carried far enough to be set down gently. And so he remained, present but unburdened, attentive but no longer responsible for every outcome. The city moved forward, confident in its rhythm, while Maddie, the horse Ianniello, watched with calm acceptance, knowing that what truly mattered had already taken root. The world around Maddie didn't slow, but his place within it softened, like a note held just long enough before resolving. He spent more time in familiar rooms where nothing needed proving. Rooms where stories were shared without urgency, where laughter arrived quietly and left the same way. These spaces felt honest. They reminded him that influence didn't always need direction. It could simply exist. He noticed how often people paused before speaking to him now, not out of caution but care. They chose words thoughtfully, aware that this was someone who listened deeply. Maddie met that care with ease. He never hurried them. Silence, he believed, was part of conversation. The city still brought him its questions, though fewer and more reflective. They were no longer about what to do, but why things mattered. Maddie appreciated those questions most. They told him people were thinking beyond outcomes, toward values, toward continuity. He walked less at night now, choosing afternoons instead, when sunlight revealed details the dark concealed. The city looked different in daylight, less dramatic, more sincere. Maddie liked that version of it. It felt closer to how he had always seen things. Sometimes he sat and watched people move past him, unaware of who he was or what he had shaped. That anonymity felt like success. It meant his work had blended seamlessly into the fabric of the place. It meant nothing depended on recognition. He was content letting others take the lead, even when they stumbled. Stumbles taught resilience. He had learned that lesson long ago and trusted others to learn it now in their own time. Conversations often ended with quiet gratitude, expressed in small ways. A lingering handshake, a nod held a second longer than necessary. Maddie accepted these gestures without deflection. They were part of closure, even if no one named it that way. He found himself thinking less about tomorrow and more about the present moment. Not because tomorrow worried him, but because the present felt complete, balanced, enough. As the city continued its endless cycle, Maddie remained a calm presence within it, no longer shaping the flow, but appreciating the current. He didn't need to be remembered loudly. He was satisfied knowing that the rhythm he had helped create would carry on naturally. And in that quiet certainty, Maddie, the horse Ianniello, rested, still, attentive, and at peace with a life lived in steady, unseen service to balance. There was a gentleness to Maddie's days now that felt earned rather than imposed. Time no longer pressed against him. It moved beside him. He woke without urgency, listened without agenda, and spoke only when words felt necessary. The city still breathed around him, but it no longer pulled. It simply existed, and he existed within it. People sometimes mistook his quiet for withdrawal. It wasn't. Maddie was still paying attention, perhaps more than ever. He noticed shifts in tone, the way new leaders carried themselves, the subtle differences between confidence and impatience. He didn't correct these differences. He observed them, trusting that experience would do what advice never could. He found meaning in continuity, a place reopening under new care but with the same respect for what came before. A conversation that echoed one from years ago, but with new voices. These weren't repetitions. They were confirmations, proof that the rhythm had outlived its origin. On certain afternoons, Maddie sat near windows and watched the city move. He saw people rushing, laughing, worrying, dreaming. He saw himself in them, not as he was, but as he had been. That recognition didn't bring longing. It brought understanding. Everyone moved at their own pace, carrying what they could, learning when to set it down. There were moments when someone tried to draw him back into decision-making, out of habit more than need. Maddie listened, nodded, and gently returned the responsibility. He wasn't abandoning anything. He was honoring growth, letting others step fully into roles they were ready for. He had learned that the hardest skill to master wasn't influence. It was release. Knowing when to stop holding something together because it had learned to hold itself. That lesson took a lifetime, and Maddie accepted it without regret. As evenings arrived, he felt gratitude more than reflection. Gratitude for conversations that had ended well, for nights that had stayed calm, for problems that had resolved quietly. These were his measures of success even now. The city carried on, endlessly creative, endlessly restless. Maddie didn't try to slow it. He trusted it. He had helped shape a foundation strong enough to support change without collapse. That knowledge settled comfortably within him, and so he continued, present without pressure, attentive without authority. A man no longer defined by what he managed, but by what he allowed to flourish. Maddie, the horse Ianniello, remained exactly where he belonged, within the rhythm, no longer steering it, yet forever part of its quiet strength. The city no longer surprised Maddie, but it still interested him. That difference mattered. Surprise belonged to urgency. Interest belonged to understanding. He had crossed that line quietly, without marking the moment, the way most meaningful transitions happened in his life. People still recognized him, though less often by name and more by feeling. A sense of ease when he entered a room. A subtle slowing of conversation. A shared understanding that nothing needed to be rushed. These reactions weren't rehearsed. They were learned over time. Learned from years of watching how he moved through moments without disturbing them. Maddie spent more time with people who expected nothing from him. Old friends who spoke about ordinary things. New acquaintances who didn't know his history and didn't need to. Those interactions grounded him. They reminded him that identity didn't have to. Not the kind written down or argued over, but the kind that lived quietly in how things were done. In habits, in pauses, in the way people chose restraint without remembering who taught them that it mattered. Maddie felt lighter than he ever had, not because responsibility had vanished, but because it had dispersed. What once rested on his shoulders now lived in dozens of others, each carrying a small, manageable part. That was how it was supposed to be. Balance was never meant to belong to one person for too long. He spent more time being still, not idle still. There was a difference. Stillness let him hear things movement never could. The city spoke in subtler ways now. Calmer tone, fewer sharp edges. Not perfect, never perfect, but resilient. Capable of absorbing shock without breaking rhythm. People occasionally stopped him to reminisce. They spoke about moments that seemed small at the time but mattered more in hindsight. A conversation that changed their approach. A decision they almost rushed but didn't. A pause that altered an outcome. Maddie listened, nodding, rarely adding anything. Those stories weren't his anymore. They belonged to the people who carried them forward. He realized then that influence didn't end, it transformed. It stopped being directional and became atmospheric. Like weather you didn't notice until it changed. Maddie had become part of the climate of the city, shaping behavior without needing to be present. There were mornings when he sat with coffee growing cold, watching light move across familiar walls, and felt no pull toward elsewhere. That feeling of having nowhere else to be was new and welcome. It meant he had arrived exactly where his life had been pointing all along. The city continued to welcome newcomers, full of urgency and ambition. Maddie watched them with quiet fondness. He knew they would learn what he had learned, each in their own way at their own pace. No lesson worth keeping arrived early. He didn't think about endings. He thought about continuity, about how things carried forward when built with patience, about how the quiet choices lasted longer than the loud ones. These thoughts didn't weigh on him. They steadied him. As another night folded gently into morning, Maddie felt no need to mark the moment.
No summary.
No conclusion. Life, he believed, didn't need punctuation. It moved best when allowed to flow uninterrupted. And so Maddie, the horse Ianniello, remained. Present, peaceful, unburdened by the need to be remembered, confident that what mattered most had already woven itself into the city's rhythm. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full in a way Maddie had come to appreciate. Full of things continuing without him needing to touch them. He noticed it one morning when he realized he hadn't checked the time in hours. The day had unfolded naturally, without structure or urgency, and nothing had gone wrong. That realization stayed with him. He spent more time revisiting places that once demanded his attention and now required nothing at all. Cafes where decisions had once been shaped over half-finished cups. Corners where conversations had shifted directions without anyone realizing why. These places felt lighter now, as if they too had been relieved of responsibility. They existed simply to exist. Maddie found himself listening more to tone than content. The way people spoke told him everything he needed to know. The sharpness had dulled. The need to rush had softened. Even disagreements carried less heat. It wasn't harmony, he knew better than to expect that, but it was maturity. The city had learned to absorb friction without igniting. There were moments when someone tried to revive old dynamics, leaning on habits that no longer fit the time. Maddie didn't correct them. He let the moment pass, trusting that the city would gently push back on what no longer belonged. Systems, once strong enough, defended themselves. He began to enjoy being underestimated. Again, not as a tactic, but as a relief. People assumed he was simply a quiet older man passing through his days. That anonymity gave him space to observe without expectation. It allowed him to see the city as it truly was, not as it behaved when it thought it was being watched. In those observations, Maddie noticed something that pleased him deeply. People had begun to protect balance instinctively. They paused when things felt rushed. They questioned decisions that felt too sharp. They chose conversation over reaction more often than not. No one credited him for this, and that was exactly right. Lessons learned fully no longer needed a teacher. He thought often about the word enough. Not in terms of achievement, but in terms of completion. Enough effort, enough guidance, enough presence. Knowing when something was enough required more wisdom than knowing how to get more. Maddie felt he had finally learned that lesson all the way through. His days developed a gentle pattern. Mornings for quiet, afternoons for walking, evenings for listening, sometimes to people, sometimes just to the city settling into night. He didn't fill his time deliberately. He let it fill itself. Occasionally, someone from long ago would appear unexpectedly. A face shaped by years, eyes carrying recognition. They'd share a memory Maddie had nearly forgotten. And for a moment, time would fold in on itself. Those moments were brief but meaningful. They reminded him that nothing he had done was ever truly lost. It had simply moved on, living in other people's choices. He felt no urge to correct history or clarify misunderstandings. Stories evolved as they always did. Truth, he believed, didn't need defense if it had been lived honestly. It survived through impact, not explanation. As seasons shifted again, Maddie noticed how easily he adjusted. Cold mornings didn't bother him. Long evenings felt welcome. Change no longer required effort. It arrived like a familiar guest. That ease told him something important. He was no longer resisting time. He was moving with it. There were nights when the city grew especially quiet, when even its usual hum seemed to rest. On those nights, Maddie felt a deep sense of alignment. Nothing was missing. Nothing needed fixing. The balance he had spent a lifetime tending now existed independently, strong enough to hold itself. And in that stillness, Maddie, the horse Ianniello, continued forward, not toward anything new, but within something complete. A life no longer defined by motion or management, but by presence. Steady, unremarkable, and quietly whole. The city entered another cycle, one Maddie recognized not by dates or events, but by feeling. It was the feeling of renewal without disruption. Things were changing, yes, but they were changing within the lines, respecting what had come before. That told him more than any headline ever could. Maddie spent time now with people who never asked him for anything. They didn't seek guidance or reassurance. They simply enjoyed his company. Conversations wandered without destination. Silence arrived without apology. These were the moments he valued most, because they asked nothing of him except presence. He noticed how often people measured success by speed, and how rarely they measured it by sustainability. Maddie had always measured it by whether things lasted without constant repair. He saw now that many around him were beginning to do the same. They spoke about pacing, about choosing carefully, about not burning out what they had worked so hard to build. The language of restraint had become common. There were still moments when his past surfaced unexpectedly. A name mentioned, a story half told. Maddie didn't correct or confirm these fragments. He let them exist as they were. History, he believed, wasn't meant to be precise. It was meant to be useful. If a story encouraged patience or thoughtfulness, it had served its purpose. He felt increasingly comfortable being on the edge of things, close enough to understand, far enough to avoid responsibility. The center had shifted, and he was content to let others stand there now. He trusted them more than they realized. Time felt generous in this phase of his life. Not because there was more of it, but because he was no longer rushing through it. Each day unfolded fully. Each moment carried its own weight and then released it. That rhythm felt right. He found himself thinking less about what he had done and more about how he had done it. The methods mattered more than the outcomes now. Patience, listening, choosing restraint when reaction would have been easier. These were not strategies. They were habits. Habits shaped a life more than any single decision ever could. The city still tested itself as cities always do. New pressures, new ambitions, new tensions. Maddie watched these with calm curiosity. He knew the cycle. He also knew the foundation was strong enough to absorb the strain. On one particularly quiet evening, he realized he hadn't felt needed in a long time, and that realization brought relief rather than loss. It meant the work had been done well. It meant independence had replaced dependence. That was the goal all along, even if he hadn't named it. As the lights came on and the city settled into another night, Maddie remained where he was, neither advancing nor retreating, simply continuing. A presence no longer central, but deeply integrated. And in that integration, Maddie, the horse Ianniello, found a quiet satisfaction that needed no audience and no explanation. The city carried on, but Maddie began to feel it carrying him now, rather than the other way around. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, like realizing you're being supported by something you once held up yourself. He didn't resist the feeling. He let it arrive and settle. His days took on a gentle structure that required no planning. He woke when he woke. He walked when the urge came. He listened more. Then he spoke, and when he did speak, his words landed softly, like they were meant to. Nothing felt wasted anymore. Not time, not effort, not silence. He noticed how people around him had grown comfortable with uncertainty. They no longer panicked at the first sign of imbalance. They waited, They observed. They adjusted. This, more than anything, told Maddie that the rhythm had been passed on successfully. The city had learned how to breathe on its own. Sometimes he watched younger people navigate moments that once would have drawn him in immediately. He saw hesitation, then restraint, then resolution. Not perfect, not always elegant, but thoughtful. He felt a quiet pride, not ownership, just appreciation. Like watching something planted long ago finally bear fruit. Maddie found himself thinking about the word care. Not care as concern, but care as attention given without urgency. He had lived his life that way without naming it. Now he saw others practicing it too. Care had become part of the atmosphere. There were afternoons when he sat somewhere public and anonymous, letting conversations wash over him. He heard fragments of plans, worries, hopes. None of them pulled at him. He trusted that these voices would find their way, just as he had once trusted his own instincts to guide him forward. He felt less defined by memory now. The past didn't tug at him. It rested quietly, complete. He no longer measured the present against what had been. Each day stood on its own, full enough without comparison. The city continued to evolve, but its evolution felt less frantic. There was still ambition, still urgency in places, but it was tempered by awareness. People paused more often. They questioned more gently. They considered consequences before momentum took over. Maddie saw himself in those pauses and smiled inwardly. He understood now that his role had never been to control outcomes. It had been to model a way of moving through complexity without becoming consumed by it. That model had spread quietly, invisibly, the way all lasting things do. As evening arrived, Maddie felt a familiar calm settle in his chest. Not relief, not fatigue, just ease. The kind that comes from alignment rather than escape. He didn't feel finished. He felt complete. And as the city's lights flickered on once more, Maddie, the horse Ianniello, remained where he was. No longer guiding the rhythm, no longer guarding it, but living comfortably within it. A man at peace with the knowledge that what he had given would continue, quietly and steadily, long after his footsteps faded into the background of the night. The city had a way of reminding Maddie that nothing truly disappeared. It only changed its shape. He noticed it in the way old habits resurfaced with softer edges, in how new ideas carried echoes of earlier ones. Continuity lived in these quiet repetitions, and Maddie found comfort in recognizing them. He began spending more time simply observing life unfold without interpretation. Children laughing in passing, strangers sharing brief kindnesses, people pausing at crosswalks caught in thought. These moments required no response, no adjustment. They existed fully on their own. Maddie realized that this, too, was part of balance, knowing when not to engage. There were days when memories surfaced uninvited, not as stories but as sensations. The warmth of a late-night room, the hum of conversation just before decisions formed, the weight of listening deeply while saying very little. These sensations no longer carried responsibility. They arrived like familiar scents and drifted away just as gently. Maddie noticed that people who met him for the first time often underestimated the depth of his stillness. They assumed it was passivity or perhaps distance. Over time, some sensed otherwise. They felt calmer around him, more grounded. He never explained why. Calm didn't need explanation. It was felt, not taught. He thought occasionally about how many lives intersected with his without either side fully realizing it. Small choices altered trajectories. Pause prevented a mistake. A suggestion softened an outcome. None of these moments were dramatic enough to remember clearly, yet together they formed something lasting. That realization felt complete in itself. The city still tested itself as all living things do. There were moments of tension, of impatience, of old instincts pushing against newer restraint. Maddie watched these moments with curiosity rather than concern. He trusted the process. Trust, he had learned, was earned not through certainty, but through consistency. His presence now felt more like permission than guidance. Permission to slow down. Permission to listen. Permission to choose care over speed. He didn't announce this permission. People felt it intuitively. They adjusted without knowing why. As seasons shifted again, Maddie found himself less aware of time passing. Days no longer felt like units to be used well or poorly. They felt whole regardless of how much happened within them. That wholeness brought ease. There were evenings when he sat quietly as the city transitioned from light to shadow, watching the moments stretch and soften. He felt no need to mark it, no need to remember it later. Being there was enough. He understood now that fulfillment didn't come from reaching a point where nothing else was required. It came from recognizing when effort could stop without things falling apart. That recognition was rare, and Maddie held it gently. The city continued on its path, layered with countless stories unfolding at once. Maddie remained part of that layering, not as a central thread, but as a steady weave that strengthened the whole without drawing attention to itself. And in that quiet integration, Maddie, the horse Ianniello, moved forward with the city, neither ahead of it nor behind it, simply within it. Steady, present, and at ease with the knowledge that what mattered most no longer needed his hands to hold it together. The city reached a point where even its restlessness felt familiar, almost gentle. Maddie sensed it in the way nights settled without resistance, in how mornings arrived without urgency. The rhythm no longer asked for correction. It simply moved, steady and sure, like something that had finally learned its own weight. Maddie's days blended together now, not because they lacked meaning, but because meaning no longer needed contrast. Each day carried its own quiet completeness, a walk that went nowhere in particular, a conversation that ended without conclusion, a silence that didn't ask to be filled. These moments were no longer pauses between important things. They were the important things. He rarely thought about what would come next. The future had stopped presenting itself as a question. It felt more like a continuation of the present, unfolding at its own pace. Maddie trusted that pace. He had learned, over a lifetime, that forcing direction only disrupted what wanted to move naturally. People still crossed his path, some briefly, some lingering a while. A few recognized him for who he had been. Most did not. Both felt equally right. Recognition had never been the point. Presence had. And he was present in the only way that mattered, without demand, without expectation. There were moments when he felt gratitude so quietly it almost escaped notice. Gratitude for having chosen patience when speed was tempting, for listening when speaking would have been easier, for carrying weight without letting it harden him. These choices had shaped not just his life, but the space around him. As time went on, Maddie felt less like a person moving through the city and more like someone the city moved around naturally. Not as an obstacle, not as a guide, but as part of its structure. Something built in, unseen, reliable. One evening, as the city lights came on one by one, Maddie paused longer than usual. He watched the glow spread, steady and unhurried. There was no revelation, no final thought, no sense of ending, just calm understanding. He knew then that his story had never been about moments of control or recognition. It had been about continuity, about leaving things better balanced than he found them, about knowing when to hold and when to let go. And so the city carried on, talking, laughing, worrying, dreaming, unaware of how much of its calm had been shaped by a man who never asked it to notice him. Maddie, the horse Ianniello, turned and continued on his way, unburdened, unhurried, and at peace. The rhythm held, the balance remained, and that was enough. Be earned daily, it could simply be lived. He noticed how often people chased relevance, mistaking visibility for meaning. Maddie had never fallen into that trap. Meaning, he knew, came from consistency, from showing up the same way even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. There were evenings when he declined invitations not because he was tired, but because he was content. Contentment, he had learned, was not boredom. It was alignment. It meant nothing was pulling him away from himself. The city continued its endless conversation, and Maddie listened without needing to respond. He trusted the next generation to interpret its needs in their own way. They would make mistakes. They would correct them. That was how rhythm stayed alive. Occasionally, someone asked him what he missed most about earlier days. Matty thought about it honestly. He didn't miss the urgency. He didn't miss the pressure. What he missed, if anything, was the learning, the discovery of how restraint could be powerful. But even that, he realized, was still present, just expressed differently now. He found peace in knowing he hadn't tried to control outcomes, only conditions. He had created space for people to act thoughtfully, for systems to breathe, for balance to settle naturally. That approach aged well. It didn't demand constant correction. As night settled again, Matty watched the city lights flicker on, each one a small story unfolding without his involvement. That didn't diminish his place in things. It affirmed it. He had helped build something that didn't require his constant attention. And in that quiet affirmation, Matty, the horse Ianniello, remained what he had always been at heart. Not a figure of force or command, but a steady presence whose greatest achievement was making steadiness feel possible. The city entered a phase Matty recognized instantly, even if others didn't have words for it. It was the phase where stories began to settle into history,